U.S. automakers giving back some of yesterday's gains. You're looking at losses here across the board. You've got GM off just about 4%. Now, this comes following the Trump administration's exemption here, at least for U.S. automakers, for at least a month on the new tariffs that have been imposed on Canada and Mexico. Let's talk about the threat that this still potentially poses to the industry, given some of that uncertainty at this point. For that, I want to bring in Dan Roeska. He's Bernstein's senior analyst. Dan, it's great to have you here. And I know you've been extensively digging into this, modeling this out, exactly the implications of what this could be. The fact that we do have a month reprieve, yes, maybe that is alleviating some of that concern, but still, what is the risk here posed to some of these largest automakers?
Good morning, Seana. Yes, look, the U.S. auto industry is about an industry of 750 billion revenues, to put this into context. And if there really were to be 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, that would take about 40 billion of extra cost into the industry and basically reduce the entire profit margin of the North American auto sector.
So I guess put that in further context, just in terms of that downside risk, exactly what that poses then to these three names.
Well, on the three names, you would likely see a severe deterioration in annual profits, probably zero at the end. Mm-hmm. And there would be a large supply chain reorganization required if those tariffs really stayed into place. I think that is one of the reasons why both the market and the industry have been assuming that these tariffs, to the extent of 25%, would be postponed, and if they really come into effect, would only be in effect for a couple of weeks, because anything beyond that would be severely detrimental to the North American and U.S. auto industry.
The supply chain disruptions, that threat, Daniel, what does that look like? The ripple effects of that when you talk about free cash flow impact, I guess how bad of a hit could we see there?
Well, free cash flow will probably be cut by half, if not more. I think the greater risk is actually that way down in the supply chain, somewhere in the tier 3, 4, 5 supplier category, you'll have some suppliers that will have to pay tariffs within 8 days, but only receive their money from their customers after 60 to 90 days. And so there's a severe risk that we will actually see bankruptcies of small parts, and it'll be the whole chip crisis, the supply crisis we saw during COVID, all over again, with the difference that while prices for cars would rise, cost would rise as well. And so there isn't really a profit upside in that supply scenario.
You know, Dan, that's very interesting. I guess when you talk about that, just the sheer ability for these automakers to even be able to pass along higher costs to consumers at this point, given the amount of pressure that consumers are under because of inflation, to what extent does that even handicap the automakers at this point?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the segment. If we think about different segments, the exposure to Mexico and Canada is different. So if we think about your Yukons, right, your large SUVs, the majority of those are made in the US, actually. They do import a lot of parts from Mexico and Canada, but it's likely that OEMs would try to pass those costs on to consumers, which in turn would have a little bit of a volume hit, but might safeguard some of the profitability. And then there are other segments where you still import a lot of cars from Japan or South Korea that would not be hit by tariffs at all. And there, South Korean or Japanese manufacturers may actually have an advantage over North American producers or US producers like Ford and GM, and gain market share during that.
You know, Dan, there was a story out this morning, Stellantis trying to bring back more production potentially here into the U.S. You mentioned the supply chain disruption, what that looks like. Just walk us through the timeline of this and how tough it is for these automakers to move some of their production back here to the U.S., just in terms of the complication factors and also just the fact that it takes time to build these plants.
Yeah, so number one, I mean, everybody's been pre-building inventories. And so I would argue that a couple of weeks of tariffs is something the industry can sustain with some downside, but it wouldn't be, it would not be the worst case scenario. If this really extends, the difficulty becomes you can reallocate some production. Let's say you have a car you produce in the US and in Mexico, shifting that then to the US, expanding a little bit the production capacity in the US on the margins in individual cases is possible. But I simply do not see how any executive right now could make a decision to build a $4 billion plant for for 200, 300,000 more cars in the US, with the uncertainty that even if the tariffs stay on now and maybe next month, will they still be around in 4 years' time, in 10 years' time? Because these plants are built for decades. And so I think the bigger long-term risk here is actually that the uncertainty of the current situation prevents any decision that on investments in the US ultimately. And I don't think that the constant back and forth without a policy really helps to make decisions for the long term.
Dan, I only have about 20 or 30 seconds here, but real quick, Tesla obviously been under pressure here, a number of factors. One of those, though, calling into question some of that demand. What do you think that looks like from an industry perspective, if we're able to extrapolate anything from that?
Yeah, I think the demand has been falling for Tesla in the US, but also internationally. You saw European values come in really badly. So I think there's a headwind right now for Tesla. And Tesla is also not immune to the tariff situation because for some models, they import up to 50% or more of their parts from Mexico.
All right, Dan, great to get your insight. Thanks so much.